7, I'm back with lesson 5 of our topic, the circle of life. So, what I want you to do, recapping from the last couple of lessons, you can see the pause symbol here, so it means you're going to have to do an activity. But remember, we're saving all the writing for the written phase at the end, so you don't have to write anything down, okay? Just see what you can remember, okay? Try and name as many groups of vertebrates and invertebrates as you can from the previous 2 lessons, okay? So again, don't write it down, just have a think, what vertebrates did we talk about, what invertebrates have we talked about, okay? So if you pause the slide now. Okay, so let's see how many you managed to think of then. So for vertebrates, there were 5 different groups, okay? We had mammals, amphibians, birds, fish, and reptiles. And then last lesson, we talked about 7 groups of invertebrates. So insects, arachnids, crustaceans, mollusks, cnidarians, worms, and echinoderms, okay? So I realise there are some really long, confusing words here. So if you didn't manage to remember all of them, that's fine. If you remembered what animals they went into one group but not the name of the group, that's perfectly fine, okay? Well done for what you did manage to remember, okay? It's fantastic. So today we're going to be looking at how are polar bears and camels adapted to survive, okay? So different animals have adaptations to different habitats. What do all of these words mean? So we've got some new words, adaptations, habitats. Okay, you may not have heard them before. You may have heard them, but not really know what we mean exactly. So an adaptation is a characteristic that an individual or species has which benefits it in its environment. So that can be a species-wide characteristic, okay, or it can be the characteristic of one individual. So if we have a look at this butterfly here, a characteristic, an adaptation that it has is its colouring, okay? It's adapted to its environment. It's adapted because it blends in, okay? It benefits it because it blends in, it's camouflaged, a bird might not see it, and it lives, okay? So a habitat, this is the natural home of a species, okay? So where it lives. So the moth being camouflaged is an adaptation because it lives in a habitat with lots of trees, okay? So it's camouflaged to the trees so it doesn't get eaten by birds. So here we've got our polar bear. So in our driving question, we said how are polar bears and camels adapted, okay? So both of these animals live in quite extreme environments, okay? So what I want you to do, we've talked about characteristics or features an animal may have that allows it to live well in its environment. So look at this picture of the polar bear. What I want you to do is to have a think, what adaptations does this polar bear have? What features does it have that makes it survive really well in its environment? Okay, so you can see the pause symbol. You can spend a little bit of time trying to think of anything you can, and then we'll have a quick talk about it, okay? So if you pause the slide now. Okay, so let's have a think about what adaptations this polar bear may have. So, first of all, he's got this white fur. You can see from his surroundings, he lives in the snow. So that white fur is going to allow him to be camouflaged, which may mean that when he's hunting something, okay, when he's trying to find food, he blends in with the environment, okay, so he's camouflaged. So it's not easy to see, but you can tell this polar bear is quite bulky, okay? He has this layer of fat around him. Now that layer of fat keeps him warm in the cold environment, okay? And it may actually help him when he's swimming as well. So he's keeping the heat in with this layer of fat. He's got big paws. So remember when we did that physics module and we talked about how a bigger surface area means that there's less the pressure is spread out. So that means the pressure is spread out from his body weight. so he doesn't sink in the snow, okay? It means that he can walk more efficiently because he's not sinking in the snow all the time, okay? So he's got this oily fur, so you can tell his fur looks a little bit like greasy here, okay? So he's got this oily fur. That oily fur means that when he goes in the water to swim, it kind of acts water resistant. So his fur isn't going to get really waterlogged, which would obviously make him really heavy, okay? So it makes him a little bit water resistant so that his fur doesn't get as wet and as heavy. Not only when he's swimming, but when he comes out, it's quicker for him to dry, so it doesn't, so he doesn't get as cold. And then our polar bear has these really tiny ears, okay? That means that he's not losing as much heat through his ears, okay? So small ears means that it keeps the heat in, which obviously he's going to want to do in the cold environment, okay? So those are some adaptations and why they're adaptations, okay? So if we talk about the adaptations, an adaptation is he's got white fur. The reason behind the adaptation is that then he's camouflaged. So what we're going to do, I've got all of the adaptations we've just talked about here. What I want you to do, okay, is you're going to pause this in a second, and then you're going to say why it's an adaptation, okay? So the reasons why it being beneficial for the polar bear to have these adaptations, okay? So again, you don't have to write it down, just have a think, maybe have a chat if there's someone else in the room with you. Okay, so if you pause the slide now. Okay, so what reasons did you come up with? So white fur, he's camouflaged, so it makes it easier to hunt without being seen. Large paws stops him sinking into the snow, and obviously if he's not constantly sinking, he's using less energy then to walk. Small ears means that less heat is lost in a cold habitat. The layer of fat acts as a layer of insulation, again, less heat is lost. And he's got this oily fur, which makes him water resistant, which means that it stops him becoming heavy. It makes it easier for him to swim, okay? So well done if you got those, fantastic. If not, just try and have a think about why these things are adaptations, okay? So that's our polar bear. So now we've got our camel. So they live in sort of hot desert environments. So what can you see in this picture that makes this camel well adapted for its surroundings, okay? So don't worry if you can't come up with anything. I think it's actually a bit easier with the polar bear than it is for the camel, okay? So if we pause the slide, come up with what you can, and then we'll have a talk through it, okay? So if you pause the slide now. Okay, so let's have a think. What are the adaptations of our camel? So you can see on top of his hump here, he's got thick fur. Okay, so that thick fur acts as shade. Obviously, this is a high point on his body; it's more exposed to the sun. So this thick fur helps him keep shaded. The camels, you can't see this, but camels actually have 2 rows of eyelashes. So they live in desert environments. There's going to be a lot of sand, okay? So these 2 rows of eyelashes mean that a lot of the sand is blocked from getting into their eyes. It allows them to see more clearly. Oh, I've got a typo here. That should say thin fur everywhere else. So you've got this thick fur here acting as shade, but there's thin fur everywhere else. He's in a desert, okay? He doesn't need that insulation from having thick fur, so he's only got this thin fur. He's got a high surface area to volume ratio, okay? So this isn't a big animal, but you can see he's got a really big side, okay? He's actually, there's a large surface area here. That means that he can quite easily lose heat, okay? So he's going to be really warm. He's in this hot climate. So he wants to get rid of heat easily, okay? So he's got this high surface area to volume ratio. And like our polar bear, he also has large flat feet. That's because, like with snow, sand also sinks when you step on it. So having these large flat feet means that the pressure is spread out and he doesn't sink as much, which makes it more energy efficient when he's walking. Okay, so quick recap. We're going to do the same thing as we did with the polar bear. So I've put the adaptations here. Have a think about why they're adaptations, okay? So if you pause this slide and have a think, so pause it now. Okay, so let's have a look at the reasons you came up with. So thick fur on top acts as shade to protect the camel from getting too hot. It's got large feet, okay, which stops the camel sinking in the sand, which saves energy. It's got thin fur everywhere else. It loses heat more easily, which it needs for this hot climate. It's got the 2 layers of eyelashes, stops the sand getting into its eyes so it can see better. And it's got a high surface area to volume ratio, which means that it loses heat more easily, okay? So it's good for the hot climate. So I know a lot of you may be thinking, oh, he lives in a hot, dry environment, so he's got the hump on his back, which stores water. Actually, that hump on his back is fat rather than water, okay? So which of these is false? We're going to pause this, have a read through. I want you to decide, and then we'll talk about your answer. So if you have a read through and pause it now. Okay, so which is false? D is false, okay? A camel has a small surface area to volume ratio to stop heat loss. It has a large surface area to volume ratio to help with heat loss, okay? It wants to get rid of the heat. So D is the false answer. If we have a look at the others, polar bear has small ears to stop heat loss. That's right, okay? So the smaller the ears, the less heat it loses through its ears. Camel's large feet to stop sinking into the sand. Yeah, that's true. Polar bear has a layer of fat to keep in heat. Well, yeah, it acts as insulation, okay? So D is our false answer. So how do animals become so well adapted? So when an animal has a good adaptation, it survives longer, okay? So a polar bear that's really well camouflaged is gonna maybe get more food than a polar bear that's not so well camouflaged because its prey may see it, okay? So it's gonna eat more food, it's gonna survive longer. So I've got that example here. If polar bear was brown, its prey would see it, so it would get less food. So the fact that it's white means that it's camouflaged, it can get more food. Because it's got more food, it's surviving longer. And when it survives longer, it can have more offspring, okay? It can reproduce more. And that adaptation gets passed on. So if you've got a polar bear, a white polar bear, that's eating loads, it's reproducing, it's going to pass on that colour, okay? It's going to pass on the white colour, okay? So when this adaptation gets passed on, the offspring will also survive and get more food. And they will then reproduce more and pass it on. So after a couple of generations, if these traits are the ones that are surviving best, if being a white polar bear camouflaged in your environment means that that's a better adaptation, then there are going to be more white polar bears within the polar bear population, okay? Other characteristics that aren't as useful disappear over time. So if we think about a brown polar bear, it's not camouflaged in its environment. It will be seen by its prey, it won't eat as much, so it won't survive as long to pass on its traits. And if it does, then its offspring won't survive as long, okay? So that's why animals, on the whole, become so well adapted, because they pass on these traits to their offspring. So, quick recap to the very first slide. What's the meaning of adaptation and what is the meaning of habitat? So if you just have a think, again, don't write it down. So if you pause the slide now. Okay, the meaning of adaptation, it's a characteristic which benefits a species in its environment, okay? And what's the meaning of habitat? Habitat, the definition of habitat is the natural home of a species, okay? So our writing phase today, working towards, you've got all of your sentence starters there. So definition of habitat is, definition of adaptation is, okay, we've just been through it. Because obviously, like I say, teachers aren't there to answer your questions. If you want to go back in a PowerPoint at all to try and help with answering some of these questions, by all means, that's not a problem. Okay, so 10 to 15 minutes we usually spend on this. So if you time yourself 15 minutes and pause this slide, answer the questions now. Okay, so let's see what answers we got. So the meaning of the words habitat and adaptation. So the definition of a habitat is the natural home of a species. The definition of an adaptation is a characteristic which benefits a species in its environment. Okay. For working at, give examples of adaptations for a range of different organisms. So adaptation of a polar bear are white fur, large paws, layer of fat, small ears, oily coat. So you can see here, we're not going into the reason why these are adaptations, we're just listing them. Adaptations of a camel are that they've got large feet, thick fur on top of the body, thin fur elsewhere, 2 rows of eyelashes, high surface area to volume ratio. If you've gone into why these are adaptations, then you're doing the Working Beyond Plus. So white fur camouflages the polar bear. It also has the large paws to stop it sinking into the snow. Polar bears have the layer of fat to keep in heat in cold climates. Polar bear has small ears, which helps it prevent heat loss, and it has an oily coat, which is water resistance to aid it when swimming. Okay. Camel has large feet, which helps it to survive by prevent it from sinking into the sand. Camels also have thick fur on the top of their body to provide shade, while it has thin fur elsewhere to help with heat loss. Camels have 2 rows of eyelashes, which helps keep sand out of its eyes. Camels have a large surface area to volume ratio, which again helps with heat loss. Okay, so if you put the reasons why, you're on the Working Beyond. And then for Working Beyond Plus, how do the adaptations of species change over many adaptations? So when an individual is well adapted to its environment, it gives the organism an advantage and it produces more offspring. The adaptation gets passed on to the offspring. Because the adaptation is an advantage, it gets stronger through the generations and is seen more within the species. This is because the individuals with the adaptation survive longer and produce more offspring. Okay, so if we then write our sentence for today, so today I've achieved, remember it's the word, not the colour or the level, and because you put, and make sure you put the reason down, so at the end of this lesson you know what you've learned today, okay? So if you write that now, and then if you go back onto show my homework, you've got that 10-question quiz, okay? Don't forget to do that because like I said in the previous couple of lessons, helping us keep track on who's engaging with lessons and whether there's anything we need to explain more fully, okay? So make sure you're doing that. I'm sure you've all done brilliant work today, Year 7, okay? Well done for logging onto these lessons and really engaging with them, okay? It's fantastic, okay? I'm really proud of the wonderful work I'm sure you're all doing, okay? And I will see you for lesson 6, okay?